private owners of HUD-assisted program properties may convert their assistance to project-based rental assistance or PBRA contracts under RAD, which provides PHAs and owners with access to longer-term funding sources. This is a big step in ensuring and securing long-term funding to maintain affordable public housing and other privately owned housing units that need repair, and while also providing the capital necessary to complete the major repairs, replacements, or capital improvements at these properties. So a little bit here about HUD's Office of Recapitalization, or RECAP. HUD's Office of Recapitalization still falls under the auspices of the HUD's multifamily housing programs. And within HUD's Office of Recapitalization, there are three major divisions, one being the Transaction Division, the second being the Closing and Post-Closing Division, and the third being the Program Administration Office. Within the Transaction Division, there are four branches. Two branches are assigned to deal specifically with RAD 1, Component 1 transactions for PHAs, and one division is assigned to deal with RAD 2 transactions, and lastly, the last division here deals with HUD's mark-to-market program. Each branch has 6 to 10 transaction managers who perform the regulatory review and underwriting of each RAD deal, and once a RAD deal is approved to go forward, the Closing and Post-Closing Division assumes responsibility for documenting the RAD transaction and follow-up, while the Program Administration Office remains responsible for policy development, operating procedures, tools, and systems. So RAD was designed as an alternative way for PHAs and owners to obtain the necessary funding to address their current backlog of capital repairs or improvements needed at their projects. HUD originally estimated there were approximately 1.2 million units in the Public Housing Inventory Program which have a capital needs repair backlog of nearly $26 billion. Now that's a lot of money for needed repairs, and due to the lack of repair funding, public housing program inventory has been declining annually, with approximately 10,000 public housing units being demolished and or disposed of each year. Lastly, RAD facilitates public and private investment in maintaining sustainable, affordable housing. While PHAs cannot borrow money specifically against public housing income, RAD allows PHAs and owners to mortgage land and buildings, which provide capital investors or lenders with an opportunity to secure the much needed capital. In addition, long-term Section 8 rental assistance program provides access to the needed subsidy or funding to help maintain the affordability of these units. 5 things that we briefly want to touch on and discuss for some of you that are still thinking about the RAD program is, number 1, RAD aids in the preservation of assisted housing programs. And assistance for units converted under RAD is provided by Section 8 rental assistance contracts, which by law must be renewed. We cannot opt out at expiration of these. This helps to ensure that the units remain permanently affordable for years to come for low-income households. Number 2, the impact on the residents is minimal, and what we mean here is that residents in units converted under RAD, especially PBRA, continue to pay 30% of their gross income towards rent and utilities, and they keep the same basic elementary rights. Number 3, RAD forces PHAs to compete in the housing market, and by this we mean RAD allows PHAs with access to the private capital markets and investors who then reinvest in the redevelopment of public housing inventory through the use of loans, mortgages, low-income housing tax credits, and or bonds. And these opportunities are afforded to private owners of assisted housing projects, but not typically previously available to PHAs specifically. So that's another great feature of RAD. Number 4, RAD maintains the PHA public stewardship, and this is an important item to keep in mind. And it means the converted project or newly developed project is maintained as affordable housing through clearly established rules, use agreements, and ongoing PHA ownership and use. The PHA's intentions to provide access to safe and affordable housing is maintained within the communities that they have dedicated to serve. Lastly, RAD is a method to obtain outside capital, as we just mentioned in number 3, and allows PHAs to compete in the housing market. It's essentially cost neutral to HUD, this program is, meaning that it does not necessarily increase HUD's housing budget. RAD essentially shifts units from the public housing program or the Section 9 program to the Section 8 program so that PHAs and owners may leverage their assets and take advantage of the private capital markets to obtain funding to make these needed capital repairs or rebuilding of units and buildings. So there are just 5 great features about RAD public housing conversions that we wanted to take a moment and share with you. On this screen here, we identify the pre and post advantages to RAD conversions. Prior to RAD, public housing properties are typically not funded at 100% in the public housing program. Section 9 program or the platform has become unreliable due to recent federal prorations and federal funding cuts. Prior to RAD in public housing, PHAs could not easily secure private debt and or equity capital to perform the needed repairs or improvements, and we just talked about that on the previous slide. Prior to RAD, the Section 9 funding level fails to keep up with the pace of deteriorating living conditions of public housing units. As mentioned, there's an estimated $26 billion worth of backlog repairs that are needed to the public housing program. And lastly, under the public housing program before RAD, residents could not choose to move from the public housing program without losing their housing assistance, unless they're eligible to receive some other form of voucher assistance. After RAD, projects are converted to Section 9 and placed on a more stable Section 8 funding platform, which by law must be renewed at expiration. PHAs of public housing units and owners of assisted housing projects can more easily borrow money now and perform the necessary rehab or repair work. After RAD, the living conditions of residents in public housing are improved due to secure Section 8 funding platform and rent calculation methodologies. And lastly, after RAD, residents may receive a tenant-based voucher or similar voucher assistance and may choose to move after 1 year in PBV or 2 years under a PB or AHAP contract without necessarily losing their rental assistance. And what we're talking about here is choice mobility, and we'll touch on that a little bit further as we get into today's webinar. On this next screen here, we included a chart as an example to help identify how the conversion under RAD PBRA is essentially cost neutral and does not necessarily impact the tenant's rent or necessarily negatively impact HUD's housing budget. This is just a high-level example here, so please understand that there are individual characteristics and implications of each RAD deal that may not mirror this example specifically, but at a high level, under the current funding premise of RAD and prior to conversion, a public housing property current income stream is determined by its operating fund, the capital fund, and the tenant rent contributions. And these are used in determining the initial RAD contract rent levels, which were previously determined by HUD early back in 2012. But more importantly, post-conversion, the RAD rent levels will be set in a new long-term Section 8 housing assistance payment contract for any project selected for conversion of assistance under RAD. And the contract rent typically constitutes the bulk of the property's operating income, contributing to roughly 70%, the subsidy payment, not the contract rent, the subsidy payment, the monthly housing assistance payment contributes roughly to 70% of the revenue post-RAD conversion. So that being said, there are numerous factors that come into play during each individual conversion that impact the TTP and subsidy, such as rent adjustments and rent increases or rent phase-in periods for larger rent increases, conversion of utilities or energy conservation measures, which may ultimately have an impact on the actual contract rent and utilities post-conversion. But what this screen is getting at is essentially the amount of operating fund and capital fund pre-conversion equates to the housing assistance payment post-conversion, in which case you can see the tenant payment roughly remains the same. So there's no negative impact on the tenant here. On this slide, we want to take a brief moment here again to discuss the overall RAD application and conversion process and the general requirements. During the beginning stages, the PHA and or private owner conducts their research and performs the initial legwork to determine eligibility and feasibility for the RAD program. There are several tools, checklists, and forms provided by HUD which must be completed in order for PHAs and owners to complete their initial assessments. PHAs and owners should take considerable amount of time early on in the planning stage to familiarize themselves with the RAD guidelines, the notices, and determine the level of rehab work or repairs needed to their projects. Take the time to research and identify and meet with potential investors and or lenders. And take the necessary time to determine if there is any existing debt on the property or properties being considered for conversion. And also to start developing their preliminary operating and development budgets. In addition, before PHAs or owners can actually apply to participate in RAD, HUD requires them to notify all residents in the project or projects about their plans to convert under RAD. And this is accommodated through a notification process, or a GIN, which is referred to as a General Information Notice. And the General Information Notice is provided to residents at the project or projects being considered for conversion. In addition to this GIN, or General Information Notice, PHAs and owners are required to conduct at least 2 resident meetings to discuss their plans and answer any resident questions that the residents may have. And these meetings serve as an opportunity for PHAs and owners to discuss the proposed conversion plans and capital improvement projects, and provide an opportunity for residents to ask questions, express their concerns, and provide comment. It's a great idea here in an opportune time for PHAs and owners to actually listen to the resident and ask for their input here as to what they feel the types of repairs or services are needed, and what they would like to see improved or added upon at the property after conversion. PHAs and owners are required to submit these resident comments and their responses to them as part of the RAD application. Okay, so for those of you still in the beginning, early planning stages, keep in mind that these tenant notification and meeting requirements, and use them as a meaningful exercise or process to help determine the true needs of the project. After the initial determination, excuse me, of eligibility, and once the resident notifications and resident meetings have taken place and all resident questions have been responded to, PHAs and owners will need to download the actual RAD application from the RAD website and complete the Excel-based RAD application. This RAD application, once completed, and all associated required attachments must then be uploaded to the RAD website, where HUD headquarters staff will review the RAD application and all the required attachments and collaborate with HUD field office staff's input on eligibility determination. While a PHA must indicate in their RAD application whether they plan to convert assistance to PBV or PBRA for a given project, ultimately they have 60 days following receipt of their commitment to enter into a housing assistance payment, or CHAP, to make and confirm their final decision of whether they wish to proceed with RAD PBV or RAD PBRA. This flexibility allows the PHA or owner and their staff and their development team to discuss and weigh both options of PBV versus PBRA with prospective lenders and with prospective investors. So PHAs and owners are not necessarily locked into the subsidy contract type initially identified in the RAD application. They do have the ability to change their minds. However, they only have 60 days upon receipt of that CHAP to confirm their decision to convert to RAD PBV or RAD PBRA. Next, upon determination and confirmation of eligibility, HUD headquarters will issue the PHA or owner with a commitment to enter into a housing assistance payment contract, or CHAP. This is what we refer to as the CHAP award process. And I think there are roughly 50% of the folks on the call today, based on the polling results, that are at this current stage. So once the CHAP has been received, PHAs and owners will have 60 days upon receipt to, again, confirm their election to PBV or PBRA. Upon receipt of the CHAP award, the PHA must also then begin the process of submitting an application into the PIC inventory removal module in order to identify those public housing units that will be converted to RAD and ultimately removed from the public housing ACC. Some good news here. HUD has developed and streamlined the PIC inventory removal application process for PHAs with RAD CHAPs, and there is additional HUD guidance published on the specific steps needed to access and complete the PIC removal process. So if any of you are not yet at this stage or would like or need any of these specific instructions, feel free to email me after today's webinar and I'll be more than happy to provide these to you. Next, HUD and the PHA will then begin conducting monthly update meetings and check-in calls to discuss pending benchmarks, what the next steps are, any upcoming deadlines, and things to help ensure that the overall conversion process continues to go smoothly. These are very important meetings, and it's important to discuss any pending issues so that both parties are aware and are on the same page with the next steps, the upcoming benchmarks, and necessary deadlines. At that point, HUD also assigns a transaction manager, and the transaction manager then becomes the HUD point of contact for the PHA or owner and helps assist them with coordinating the remaining facets of the RAD conversion process. The monthly HUD update calls continue between the HUD transaction manager, the PHA or owner, HUD field office staff, and potentially any other PHA investors or lenders or consultants that they're using on their conversion deal are welcome to join these calls so that it's an open forum to discuss, again, any issues that the PHA may see with regard to upcoming benchmarks or deadlines. It's important to note that within 30 days of issuance of the CHAP, the PHA must also issue, or the PHA selected lender must issue, and the PHA must accept a lender engagement letter, and that the PHA or owner financial plans must then be submitted to HUD for review and approval within 6 months or 180 days after issuance or receipt of the CHAP. So having your homework done here and finalizing any lender or investor requirements or negotiation goes a long way to ensuring that the financial plans are prepared and they're thoroughly reviewed and submitted timely and accurately to HUD, which will help prevent any processing or conversion delays. Next, the RAD conversion commitment, or the RCC, is issued by HUD to the PHA or the owner of the project, and the project closes, at which time public housing units are removed from the ACC. There's a release from HUD from the Declaration of Trust, or the DOT, which removes HUD's interest in the public housing property. Both parties then sign and execute the HAP contract, a RAD use agreement, and close the project financing. Lastly, at this point, ongoing administration of the RAD converting project is transferred and conducted by HUD staff. This post-conversion administration or monitoring includes any compliance reviews or management occupancy reviews, a REAP physical inspection, and or any financial audit submissions. These are all tools that HUD uses to evaluate ongoing project operations. So we took a few minutes here to describe the overall RAD conversion process at a high level for those PHAs or owners who have not yet initiated the application or conversion process. So we discussed at a high level the overall process, but we have not yet discussed is RAD is composed of two basic components, and there are Component 1 transactions and Component 2 transactions. Component 1 transactions are for PHAs converting public housing units, and there was a change in regulation back in 2015 that restricted Component 1 transaction deals to only PHAs. Prior to the new regulation, PHAs and some private owners of HUD legacy type program properties could apply for Component 1 transaction, but that's no longer the case for any new applications. Component 1 is strictly for PHAs converting public housing units. Component 1 transactions are the most popular, and it is a highly competitive application process, with applications scored or ranked based on several factors. RAD Component 1 transactions had a previously imposed limit on the number of units authorized for conversion, and that limit initially authorized up to 60,000 units. However, back in December 2014, due to the high level of interest and popularity of the RAD program, HUD had received applications for more than 176,000 units. So the unit cap had to be raised, and it was ultimately lifted to 185,000 units, where it still stands today. As of December 2015, the 185,000 unit cap has been met, so all RAD applications received after that time frame are placed on a wait list until the current cap limit is either raised again or lifted entirely. So if there are PHAs out there that are still interested in participating in RAD who have not yet started the process, I'd suggest that you get your applications submitted as soon as possible. It is a highly competitive application process, so time is of the essence if you are interested here. Component 2 transactions are for private owners of HUD's legacy type program properties such as mod rehab, rent sup, or RAP, rental assistance payment properties. And Congress authorized the PBRA subsidy as an alternative to project-based vouchers for RAD Component 2 transactions back in 2015's Omnibus Appropriations legislation. Use of PBRA contracts is key for preserving older assisted Section 236 and 221D3 program properties that have 40-year contracts that are expiring without any renewal options. So they felt it was important to open up PBRA to some of these program properties under Component 2. Component 2 transactions are much less popular than Component 1. And there is no competitive application process at this time. I believe there are approximately 38,000 units under HUD's legacy program properties that are in the same situation as the public housing program, where there is a backlog of repairs needed, which exceeded funding availability. Both Component 1 and 2 transactions are able to convert assistance to PBRA. And just a note for each of you on the call that back around the first of the year in January 2016, the first 4 RAD Component 2 PBRA preservation projects did close. So there is some good progress here on HUD's part and interest of private owners of these properties as well. Some unique distinctions for RAD PBRA conversions. We all discussed the 2 components to RAD, and now we want to get into some of the distinctive specifics of conversion to PBRA. And there are several unique factors or distinctions when PHAs or owners decide to convert assistance under PBRA. On the next few slides, we're going to discuss the contract-related items that PHAs and owners must be aware of for conversion under PBRA. Following up with this, we'll also then discuss some of the other subsidy-related items that pertain to PBRA. So these initially involve initial contract terms, a cap on the number of assisted units authorized to convert, rent caps on the units being converted, and the method for adjusting contract rents and utility allowance. Once conversion is complete and has occurred, all of these requirements will fall under many of HUD's multifamily housing program rules, notices, and handbooks. So initial contract terms for PBRA is 20 years. That's the required minimum, as opposed to the minimum of 15 years for conversion under PBV. Although PBV contracts can request up to 20 years if they choose. All PHAs and private owners wishing to convert assistance under RAD PBRA must be willing to and agree to accept a 20-year HAP contract. There's no ways around this. This is the requirement to elect to convert under PBRA. Another requirement is that the PHA must agree to a renewal contract upon expiration of the initial 20-year PBRA HAP. So keep that in mind for future years when the original PBRA HAP contract does expire. I'm certain many of us may not be around anymore. Hopefully I will be retired on a beach or a golf course somewhere. But keep that in mind, 19, 20 years from now when that contract expires, it is a requirement that that contract be renewed under the PBRA program regulations. Cap on the number of units authorized to convert. We discussed initially that was 60,000 units for component 1, which has been lifted up to 185,000 units now under current legislation. Unlike conversion under RAD PBV, where only 50% of the units within a project can be converted, and there are some exceptions to that rule, there is no cap on the number of assisted units within a project to convert under RAD PBRA. So this is a really good thing for PHAs and owners to be aware of. It provides greater flexibility and does not restrict the number of units allowed to convert. Next, we talk about rent caps here, and here's a pretty good distinction between the PBV and the RAD PBRA contracts. Under PBRA, the rent levels cannot exceed 120% of the fair market rent, or the FMR, unless the current rents are determined to be less than market in the project area, in which case they cannot exceed the lower of market, or 150% of FMR. So benchmarks here are 120% of FMR up to 150% FMR, or what's determined to be comparable market rent. For PBV, the rents cannot exceed the lower of reasonable rent determination, or 110% of FMR. So under PBV, the rents could be considerably less than they are under PBRA. Quick discussion here for purposes of determining market rents. Normally, comparable market rents are determined through the use of a rent count study, or what we refer to as an RCS. And an RCS is completed by a state certified license appraiser hired on behalf of the PHA or owner to complete the RCS. And the RCS is submitted in accordance with the requirements listed in Chapter 9 of HUD Section 8 Renewal Policy Guide. Again, those are just the requirements for a rent comparability study. That being said, a note to clarify that an RCS is not necessarily required as part of the actual RAD application itself. However, PHAs and owners will definitely want to conduct a survey of other nearby projects, especially those with unrestricted rents within the area, to determine where the project's rents are in comparison to the market rents in the immediate surrounding area. And HUD will also want to know how the project rents listed in the application were determined prior to their approval. So they may also ask that a market analysis or RCS be completed, or may ask the PHA or owner for information on how they arrived at those rents, especially for units located in high operating areas or areas where there may be high vacancy losses, or those exceeding 120% of FMR. Just to note that HUD's Renewal Policy Guide has a chapter, and that's Chapter 9, which outlines the requirements of rent comparability studies. This Renewal Policy Guide was updated by HUD back in August 2015 and made some changes that were then effective in November 2015. So just be certain to review the most recent version of the Renewal Policy Guide with any questions that you may have pertaining to rent comp studies or market studies in the event that you are asked to submit one or perform one. Next, we're going to talk about a method for adjusting contract rents. And PBRA and PBV2 both utilize HUD's Operating Cost Adjustment Factor, or OCAF method, for adjusting contract rents throughout the term of the PBRA HAP contract. And OCAFs are also used for all other HUD multifamily housing projects renewed under HUD's Multifamily Assisted Housing Reform and Affordability Act, or what we refer to as MARA. I'm sure you'll know by now that there are a multitude of HUD acronyms used in our lines of business on a daily basis, and we may be adding to your repertoire of some of these acronyms under RAD here today. But OCAF factors essentially are published annually by HUD in the Federal Register around October each year, and they're typically effective in February of the following year. And the time period between October to February provides HUD with the needed time to update their online systems, such as IREMS, with the new factors. And HUD publishes this schedule noting the factor that applies for each state or each geographic location every year. So now some of you may have heard or be familiar with HUD's Auto OCAF program, and that is a HUD implemented program for multifamily projects that are administered by PBCAs. The Auto OCAF program simplifies the submission requirements for owners, and it also reduces the rent adjustment processing burden and timeframes for PBCAs and HUD staff. However, projects with units being converted under RAD are not yet eligible to participate in the HUD Auto OCAF program, and I'm sure HUD may reconsider their position on this in the future, further on down the road, after the RAD projects have been in operation for several years. But for right now, PHAs and owners are required to physically prepare and submit these OCAF rent adjustment requests directly to HUD each year, 120 days prior to the half anniversary date. On another quick note, the initial RAD rents were initially determined by HUD back in 2012, as mentioned previously, when they were developing the RAD program, and these initial rents will be adjusted or inflated by OCAF beginning in 2014. So there's some good news here for PHAs and owners. You may be seeing a few more bucks worth of revenue in your budgets due to these OCAF increases being applied for 2013 and 2014. So OCAF adjusted rents are effective on the half anniversary date. However, the actual OCAF submission itself is due to HUD at least 120 days prior to the half anniversary date. So PHAs and owners out there, please keep your half anniversary dates in mind to ensure timely submission of your OCAF requests. Timely submission of OCAF adjustment requests provides and allow for sufficient processing time, which is needed by HUD staff to review and approve the OCAF adjusted rents and request and secure the funding for the project for the upcoming year. On a side note here, there is quite a bit of behind the scenes type work that goes on while processing these OCAF requests. Upon receipt, HUD staff, they have to review the submission, make sure it's signed and dated. They have to review it for accurate calculations and unit distributions. They have to review and verify the debt service computations, and they also check HUD systems for any owner debarment. They then have to request and receive adequate funding levels for the project for the upcoming term of this multi-year contract, and then ultimately prepare and execute the contract-related documents. So there's quite a bit, as I mentioned, that goes in behind the scenes, and we're going to spend a few minutes here today on the OCAFs because this is something that PHAs and owners will be required to do for the next 15 to 20 years. So the first step in the actual OCAF process is for PHAs and private owners to identify the appropriate OCAF factor from the Federal Register based on the project's location. So for example, if the project's located in Indianapolis, Indiana, PHAs or owners will use the current OCAF factor published for the state of Indiana, and will apply that factor, which is usually a percentage, to the project's operating costs. PHAs and owners determine the project's operating costs by computing the amount of annual debt service on the project and subtracting the amount of debt service from the project's current annual expiring Section 8 rent potential. Debt service here, another side note, is normally a constant throughout the term of the contract and the term of the mortgage on the property, so it doesn't necessarily change. As opposed to other operating expenses such as utility costs, taxes, insurance, project supplies, and salaries. Normally these are things that fluctuate and increase each year, and that's why the OCAF is applied only to these so-called operating costs, hence the term OCAF. Once the debt service is computed and removed from the current rent potential, the remaining amount is what we refer to as the rent potential attributed to the project's current operations. And this is the amount that is applied by the applicable published OCAF factor to arrive at an adjusted contract rent potential for the upcoming year. The new OCAF adjusted contract rent potential is then divided by the old expiring contract rent potential so that we arrive at what we refer to as an increase factor. This increase factor is then multiplied against the old expiring contract rents for each unit size to arrive at the new contract rent for each unit size for the upcoming year, and ultimately determine what the new adjusted annual contract rent potential is for the upcoming year. I realize this may sound like a very convoluted or complicated process, but I can assure you it's not as difficult as it may seem. And the good news is HUD has automated and released an Excel-based version of their OCAF worksheet, which completes the calculation steps automatically for you. So the most challenging part that you may find is determining what the project's annual debt service actually is. Versions of the OCAF worksheet are available online at HUD Clips or HUD.gov, or they can also be found by a simple Google search online. However, if any of you need the current OCAF worksheet or OCAF worksheet instructions, feel free to email me after today's webinar and let me know, and I'll be more than happy to provide them to you. Again, just a reminder, it's important to remember to start this process as early as possible, as submissions are due to HUD 120 days prior to the HAP anniversary date. Another side note here, this is an area where we as PBCAs in several states tend to see a lot of issues, albeit late submissions or incomplete submissions or errors in calculations or computations in the submissions, errors in computation of debt service, which ultimately impact the remaining calculations. These are issues that tend to delay our review and approval process, and HUD's approval process as well, and they often result in the rent increase process not being finalized prior to the HAP anniversary date. So keep that in mind, that later incomplete submissions have also resulted in a temporary loss or a stop of subsidy flow to the project, which is not good. In the event that the OCAF adjustments are not finalized and approved and implemented on the HAP anniversary date, there may be a lapse in subsidy. And projects need their operating subsidy to pay their bills. So again, it's just important to prepare and submit true, accurate, and complete submissions in a timely fashion each year. Once the adjusted contract rents and the new annual rent potential is approved by HUD, a new low rent schedule, HUD Form 92458, will be executed by HUD and the PHA or the owner and returned along with a new Exhibit A, which serves as an amendment to the HAP contract for the upcoming year. PHAs and owners are encouraged to post these approved and executed forms in your project or rental offices, as they should be made available for inspection by applicants and tenants, and they will also be requested by HUD staff during a compliance review or management and occupancy review. So keep these forms handy, make a copy of them, and post them on bulletin boards in your offices, and ensure that they're readily available for review and inspection. A note here real quick is that we have heard rumors in the industry previously that RAD PBRA contracts may be assigned over to PBCAs, which HUD has recently denied. HUD has communicated that they will retain oversight and administration of these RAD PBRA contracts, at least for now anyways. So you will continue to work directly with your HUD account managers or project managers in the upcoming years while processing any OCAF adjustments. As drilled home a few minutes ago, the OCAF submissions due 120 days prior to the HAP anniversary date. HUD staff will review and evaluate the submission and approve the submission, or may ask for additional information if data in the submission is incomplete or does not agree with information in their system of record. And once the OCAF is processed and funds for the upcoming year have been reserved and obligated, the new rents will be approved, a new low rent schedule, and Exhibit A will be issued to the PHA or owner. Once the new low rent schedule and the Exhibit A have been received by the PHA or owner, you'll then need to go in and process what we refer to as a gross rent change in your HUD compliant software system. The increased rents are effective on the HAP anniversary date, and the approved gross rent change, once processed in the software system, must be submitted electronically to HUD's Tenant Rental Assistance Certification, or TRAC system, TRACS is the official data system used by HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs. It is an online system, and it retains and stores all assisted tenant certification data for tenants under HUD's multifamily housing programs. And we'll talk a little bit more about TRACS as we get further into the webinar because PHAs and owners will require access. Upon receipt and acceptance of the gross rent change that was submitted by the PHA or the owner to TRACS, the property or project may then voucher for the higher contract rents for the remainder of the upcoming year, and then the process starts all over again the following year. Just a quick note here that after determination of initial RAD rents, application of any OCAF adjustment cannot result in rents that are less than the initial RAD rents. So that's good news. There's no possibility of a rent reduction here as a result of an OCAF adjustment. Next, we're going to switch over and talk for a few minutes about utility allowances and the utility allowance analysis. This is another big change or distinction between PHAs are you used to or familiar with versus what will be required under RAD PBRA going forward. First off, it's suggested that PHAs and owners not complete a UA analysis prior to conversion under RAD because they will be required to use their PIH approved UA for the remaining calendar year after conversion. During the remainder of the initial calendar year of funding, the project receives only what it would have received under the public housing program. So it carries forward, uses, and exhausts all remaining operating and capital funds for that year. In addition, there may be several other reasons for not conducting a utility allowance analysis prior to RAD conversion, such as conversion and rehab work may include energy conservation measures or conversion of utility types, say from electric to gas or vice versa. So utility allowance analysis performed prior to conversion would not be true and indicative of an anticipated utility expense after conversion. Secondly, utilities may be converting from PHA or owner paid to tenant paid after conversion, so keep that in mind. Which leads me to my next discussion point, that the methodology used to calculate UAs under the PIH or public housing programs are not generally accepted under HUD's multifamily housing programs. HUD multifamily housing programs release new guidance on calculating utility allowances, and that is HUD Notice H 2015-04. That was originally released back in June 2015, so just over a year ago. And then a revised version of the notice was released again in September of 2015. For informational purposes, HUD Multifamily has been working for quite some time on ways to help clarify and streamline the UA analysis process under the multifamily housing programs, and has strived for years to try and provide a national standard for an acceptable analysis. So for years there was minimal HUD guidance on how to conduct a proper UA analysis until recently. And currently, UA analysis must be calculated based on a required minimum sampling, which is based on the number and type of units at the project. And the completed UA analysis recommendation must be included with the OCAF rent adjustment submission each year. Keep this in mind when preparing future OCAF requests. We talked about incomplete submissions a few minutes ago. The recommendation and supporting utility allowance analysis documentation, such as copies of consumption data or printouts or utility bills, may also be included with the OCAF rent adjustment submission for post-RAD conversion units. In the notice, there is an attachment A that includes a sample format, inclusive of formulas, to average out utility costs for each unit size. So please take a few moments and familiarize yourselves with this notice if you're not already familiar with it. And just an FYI that it is possible for HUD to delay or deny the processing of an OCAF adjustment until they receive the utility allowance analysis and supporting documentation. Another note here is that utility allowances under HUD's multifamily housing programs must be increased mid-year when changes in the utility rates result in an increase of 10% or more to the recently approved utility allowance. So please keep that in mind too, and keep an eye out for your utility rates in order to determine if they warrant an adjustment to the current utility allowance analysis. PHAs and owners must also be familiar with the tenant notification requirements at 24 CFR 245.405A and 245.410. Essentially, these standards state that tenants must be provided with a minimum of 30-day notice for any utility allowance decrease, as this decrease may have an impact on the tenant's total payment or the total tenant payment or tenant rent. Excuse me there. So be certain to allow appropriate time frames for the tenant notification process to ensure that any UAs are able to be implemented on the approved effective date, and a reminder about the requirement to include this analysis with the OKF submission. We'll take a moment here to talk about utility conversions, and keep in mind that one of the stated goals of RAD Component 1 is to provide greater incentives for PHAs to undertake energy conservation measures, and this includes permitting RAD contract rents to increase by a portion of the estimated savings in resident utility allowances. So savings in tenant utility allowances may also provide an increase to the RAD contract rents. Again, this is a stated goal of one of the RAD components to provide greater incentives for PHAs. For RAD PBRA conversions, if the conversion plans will result in energy and water efficiency improvements, they can submit utility allowance projections performed by a professional engineer based on the project's plans or specs. And if approved by HUD, these utility allowances will be used to modify the initial PBRA contract rents in the HAP contract, the PBRA HAP contract. So there are incentives here for PHAs and owners to undertake utility conservation measures and or utility conversions during the RAD conversion process. Be sure to discuss these with your HUD transaction manager and or some of your investors and or potential lenders in the deal that you're looking to put together. And just a couple of added notes here about the timing of utility conversions. If conversion from PHA or owner-paid utilities to tenant-paid utilities occurs after the RAD conversion date, then the utility conversion must be effective at the property's next HAP contract anniversary date, so it will not necessarily go into effect at the time of HAP contract execution. Just a reference here that Chapter 12, Section 5 of HUD Handbook 4350-01, which is HUD's Asset and Project Servicing Manual, describes the procedural requirements for utility conversion requests. So PHAs and owners planning to convert utilities, you may want to familiarize yourselves with that section in that chapter. Now that we discussed the RAD PBRA contract-related items, I want to shift our focus over to the occupancy-related items, since many of these may be new to some PHA staff. Policies, procedures, and occupancy-related items developed under RAD PBRA must adhere to HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs and the relevant housing notices, memos, guidebooks, such as HUD Handbook 4350.3, which is their occupancy guidebook, or the 4350.01, which is the HUD Multifamily Asset and Project Servicing Manual. The HUD Section 8 Renewal Policy Guidebook, I mentioned that a while back during rent comparability. That's another guidebook that post-RAD processing, RAD PBRA will fall under the auspices of. So familiarize yourselves with these, download them, make them available for your staff to review and reference. They are important and provide just a wealth of information and knowledge on some of these topics. So over the course of the next few slides, we're going to discuss project waiting lists, affirmative fair housing marketing plans, lease requirements, house rules, tenant selection plans, some grievance procedures, pets, and resident rights. The first item that we want to discuss here is the waiting list. And a PHA owner may choose between several types of waiting lists for new applicants who are applying to move to the converted RAD properties. How a waiting list is managed could drastically impact the effect of the waiting list preferences, any transfers between RAD properties or within the same jurisdictions, and the timeline for an applicant to be on the waiting list. Also, if a PHA is proposing to change the type of waiting list, an example here from, say, a program-wide to a site-based waiting list, applicants and tenants need to be educated, and they need to know what they might need in order to get on the new list, or or if the PHA or owners is going to automatically just convert them to this new list. So it's important to define the process here and communicate that process to the applicants and tenants on the existing waiting list in the event you switch to a new waiting list format. Details of the waiting list depend on whether the RAD project is converting to PBV or PBRA. For PBRA, the PHA or owner can develop a project-specific or community-wide waiting list. The creation of the waiting list for projects not yet closed under RAD and undergoing conversion will be done with the existing PIH rules. However, after closing, waiting lists for RAD PBRA converted projects must conform to HUD's multifamily housing program requirements. A PHA or owner may not adopt a preference that would have the purpose or effect of substantially delaying or denying the participation of other eligible families in the program on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, or familial status, or would create or perpetuate a segregation. The RAD notice states that the PHA shall consider the best means to transition applicants from the current public housing waiting list to the new waiting list format. So keep that in mind too when converting. A PHA or owner community waiting list is different from a public housing community-wide waiting list. Prior to RAD conversion, the PHA shall refer to PIH 2012-32 for guidance and consider the best means to transition applicants from that wait list to the RAD converted project wait list. To ensure that applicants are appropriately and fairly selected for the next available unit, it is essential that PHAs and owners maintain waiting lists with appropriate information which is taken from the application. Post-RAD conversion PBR waiting lists, they have to include the following. They're required to have the date and time the application was submitted or received by the PHA or owner. It must include the name of the head of household, their estimated annual income level, and again, it could be extremely low income, very low income, or low income. It doesn't necessarily have to identify what their actual income is. And identifying the annual income level is helpful for any income targeting practices. The waitlist format must identify the need for an accessible unit. So if a unit's being requested by an applicant, it must be noted on the waitlist. And it must identify any preferences sought by the applicant and also identify the unit size being requested by the applicant or applicant family. So bear in mind that keeping the waiting list as up to date as possible will help reduce errors, minimize processing timeframes, and reduce administrative resources that are expended on processing information regarding applicants. And I can't say how many times staff have processed applications for someone who is ineligible or who is no longer interested in the property. We've seen this happen quite frequently where they near the top of the waiting list and are contacted and are no longer interested or no longer eligible to occupy a unit in the project. And this tends to waste precious staff time and resources, project resources. So it's important to keep these waiting lists up to date as possible. While additional information such as race and ethnicity or gender and family size may be collected on the rental applications and retained in the project applicant files or the project files, it's a good practice or idea to avoid including this information from the actual wait list itself. This information may not be directly relevant to the tenant selection process. It may potentially result in a possible discrimination against some applicant, or it could subject the PHA or owner to potential litigation. So my suggestion is we not include that types of information on the post-RAD converted PBRA waiting list. Understand that an applicant or applicant family may also be on multiple waiting lists or waiting lists for more than one unit size. So based on the application dates and times and qualification for preferences, if used, placement on these multiple waiting lists may vary. Just a note, when there is a change made in the waiting list, say an action is taken as a move-in or an applicant rejection or any other activity specific to an applicant occurs, it's important to include notations or comments These notation or comments should be included on the waiting list. There should be a column for these. It's extremely helpful to capture and identify the dates that any actions were taken for any of the applicants. The goal of the note or the comment or the annotation is to provide an auditable record of applicant additions, selections, or withdrawals, or maybe rejections, or any other updates to applicant data that have been taken and the dates they were taken. It's important here because independent reviewers or auditors are going to be looking at the wait list, and they should be able to locate any applicant tenant that's placed on the wait list. They should be readily confirmed that an applicant or tenant was housed at the appropriate time based on unit size standards, preference, or income targeting. And they should be easily able to trace and identify various actions taken with respect to a family's application. So auditors are going to look to see if your waiting list format complies with HUD requirements, but they're also going to be looking at selection of applicants and tenants from the waiting list to determine if they're being selected properly in accordance with PHA's or owners' policies and procedures and HUD regulations. Lastly, I'd like to discuss what we refer to as a best practice here. PHAs and owners should periodically analyze their waiting list and conduct applicant updates to ensure the list is current and up to date with qualified applicants. Actual waitlist formats can be maintained in either hard copy or electronic format. Just a note there, and the two different versions. Manually maintained hard copy waiting list must be maintained as a permanent record. This is referred to as the old bound book method. Keep in mind that the list must not be rewritten, or if a list must be rewritten for some reason, it is rewritten in the same specific order as the old wait list. Be sure to maintain a copy of the old wait list for reference as to why the wait list had to be rewritten. The wait list must be maintained in a manner that cannot be easily altered. So here we're referring to like permanent ink or pen, not pencils that
muted.
Whiteout used on any of the waiting list. So the list must also be kept in a manner that can be audited, and the manual waiting list must provide an easily viewable record of the date and time of each application, the date and time of selection for tenants. Electronic waiting list must have a mechanism for maintaining the date and time of each applicant's placement or selection from the waiting list and a way to document changes made to the list. So electronic waiting list should be reprinted anytime an action is taken to provide that permanent physical evidence of actions taken. Even though the list is maintained electronically, it will require some occasional printing and maintenance in a folder or a binder to provide this auditable record. My suggestion is that waiting lists in general, regardless of format, be reviewed, updated, and purged at least twice a year to ensure they're up to date, they're accurate, and they have only qualified applicants who are interested at residing at the property. So keep that in mind. Annual update letters, maybe twice a year, sending them out to folks, seeing if they're still interested. That will certainly reduce some of your processing time for folks nearing the top of the wait list. Here we include a snapshot of what a sample waiting list might look like, which may be incorporated in the project's post-rehab PBRA waitlist format. A note here that the majority of software providers do a really good job at maintaining applicant data electronically, which allows PHAs and owners to easily track and edit or change applicant data. So keep that in mind too as you determine which way you plan on maintaining your waitlist data. Next, a few minutes here on the affirmative fair housing marketing plans. Every PHA and owner converting under RAD PBRA must develop and provide a description of the affirmative fair housing marketing plan for the project being converted. This is Form HUD 935-2A, which is a standardized form developed by HUD. The Fair Housing Act requires HUD to administer all programs and activities related to HUD in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. And additionally, sets forth HUD's equal opportunity regulations for affirmative fair housing marketing under FHA subsidized and unsubsidized housing programs. So the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan is a requirement under RAD PBRA. It's a requirement of the RAD Financing Plan submission. So it must be reviewed and approved by HUD prior to RAD closing. So keep this document in mind when preparing and submitting your financing plans for those of you that have not yet done so. The HUD-approved Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan must also be attached to the RAD PBRA HAP contract, and this becomes Exhibit 3 for both Component 1 and Component 2 PBRA RAD transactions. Quick note here, Quadel Consulting and Birch Island Real Estate have teamed up together and will be sponsoring a webinar on Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plans that's going to come up in September. That's going to include tips and instructions for actually completing this form. So any of you have an interest out there, either check on our website for details or email me after today's webinar, and I'd be more than happy to provide you with the details of that. The current version of the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan 935-2A expires December 31st, 2016. Again, keep that in mind and be sure to use the current version of the form in your submission to HUD. Otherwise, HUD or the Office of FHCO may kick it back or reject it, and that will delay your approval process. Current version of the plan is available for download on HUD Clips or HUD.gov, and again can be found through a simple online Google search. In the event any of you need a current version of this form, again, feel free to email me after today's webinar, and I'll be more than happy to provide that to you. Included in the plan, PHAs and owners must describe the demographics of the project population and the surrounding housing market area. The project population data is relatively easy to retrieve, site software, or the existing tenant file data. However, demographics for the project surrounding area is going to require PHAs and owners to obtain access to online census data. And there is a website that's included in the instructions of this form under the census.gov website that'll provide you access to the information needed for the surrounding area of your project. A note here too is that maps of the census tract area are required and must be printed and included with the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan submission. Failure to provide these maps could result in the plan again being kicked back or denied and require correction, which may further delay the process. Lastly, here, once approved, the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan is good for 5 years unless demographics in the surrounding area change or the PHA or owner wishes to change their advertising media. So if it's determined that the previous advertising media was unsuccessful, PHAs and owners have the right to change advertising media. However, it will require an update to this plan. The plan will have to be submitted and re-reviewed by HUD for approval. Also, the approved Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan must be displayed in any rental office or PHA owner office or location where leasing activities are being conducted or held. Keep that in mind. Bulletin boards. This document should be readily available to applicants and or tenants, and also any HUD reviewers or compliance auditors on site. This is a fairly common finding which we have seen and can be easily avoided. So upon receipt of the approved plan, it's a great idea just to make a couple of copies and include them in any project areas, common areas, or offices, or places where you're actually conducting leasing activities. All advertising must include either the HUD Affirmative Fair Housing Equal Housing Opportunity logo, slogan, or statement. Keep that in mind. All advertising depicting persons should depict members of eligible protected classes, including individuals from both majority and minority groups. Special note here is be careful in using certain slogans, advertising phrases, or words such as kid-friendly or maybe a quiet, safe neighborhood as depicting certain types of housing or communities, or promoting advertising towards certain populations or groups may subject you to potential fair housing litigation. Copies of all advertising media should be maintained in an advertising folder at the project and produced or made available during a compliance review or audit. HUD staff and auditors will be looking for evidence that you are in fact advertising in accordance with your approved plan. So if the approved plan states you're going to run a 2x3 ad on a weekly basis in the local journal or newspaper, staff or auditors are going to ask for copies of that or any other documentation to ensure that you actually are in fact advertising in accordance with your plan. Again, we've conducted compliance audits and management occupancy reviews for multifamily projects that were not able to provide evidence of marketing or blatantly stated that they were not aware of the requirement to advertise in accordance with their plan, or they weren't aware that they had to advertise at all, which is not good. And this usually results in a citation or a finding on the project's compliance report or MOR. So be sure to retain copies of any advertising media or copies of advertisements and have them available for review and inspection. On to leases and lease attachments. PHAs and owners converting under RAD PBR must use the HUD-approved model lease agreement, and this is HUD 901-05-A. This lease is widely available from all software providers. It's available on HUD Clips or HUD's website. It's available in Word version, and it's also available in many languages to comply with limited English proficiency requirements. Important note here, for in-place tenants at the time of RAD conversion, the model lease must have a lease effective date equal to the HAP contract effective date and must be signed by the PHA owner and the tenant on or before the HAP contract effective date. So keep that in mind. And also, changes to the model lease are not permitted without prior HUD approval. However, the use of HUS rules, lease attachments, and lease addendums are allowed and may include other stipulations not identified in the actual body of the lease. In addition to the actual lease itself, there are several other pieces of documentation required as lease attachments, and these are the HUD 5059 and 59A certification, which is signed by the PHA and the owner, the move-in inspection form, Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA lease addendum. That's another required attachment to the lease. And we'll talk a little bit more about VAWA in a moment here, but house rules also, if they're developed or applicable to the project, are required lease attachments, as is any lead-based paint disclosure forms, pet rules, owner's live-in aid addendum, or other police or security personnel addendums. We mentioned a moment ago that modifications to the actual lease itself are not typically allowed. However, if changes must be made, it will require HUD headquarter approval. But typically these are incorporated as a lease attachment or lease addendum. A note here that modifications to any lease require a proper 60-day notice, which must be served to the tenant only at the term of their lease. So these changes cannot be made during the course of the current lease term, only upon lease expiration. So that's important to note there. We just mentioned VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Act, and RAD PBRA conversion requires that PHAs and owners include the VAWA lease addendum, which is Form 91067, which ultimately also requires the PHAs and owners to comply with the requirements of VAWA. Now, VAWA originated back in 2005 and was reauthorized again under VAWA 2013. And currently under HUD's proposed final rule for VAWA, that was issued on April 1st, 2015. Essentially under VAWA, victims or threatened victims of domestic violence, abuse, stalking, sexual assault, dating violence, or criminal activity have certain protections or rights from any affiliated offending individual. And these protections or rights include the provision of evicting that victim from federally assisted housing programs as a result of them being a victim. Now, this doesn't mean the offending individual is allowed to remain in the unit, and the victim must also take responsible action here, but it does provide them with certain rights. In the interest of time today, we're not going to go into the specifics of VAWA. However, I would like to point out that this is available. HUD's proposed final rule on the Violence Against Women Act, which is the most recent, is available online at HUD.gov or at HUD Clips. Again, in the event that you need this, feel free to email me after the webinar, and I'll be sure to provide that to you as soon as possible. Moving on to house rules. For other HUD multifamily housing programs, the decision about whether to develop house rules beyond resident rights requirements, that rests solely with the PHA or the owner. However, that's not the case here under RAD PBRA. PHAs and owners of properties converting under RAD PRA must adhere to the resident rights and participation requirements which relate to termination, notification, and grievance procedures, but they must also comply with Attachment 3 of the RAD Guide. So if a PHA or owner develops additional house rules beyond these resident rights, the house rules must be consistent with HUD requirements for operating HUD subsidized projects. The rules must be reasonable in nature and must not be too restrictive so as to infringe upon, say, a tenant's civil rights. And take note here that house rules must be included and provided to HUD along with the project's financing plan. So developing a set of house rules is a prudent practice. By identifying both allowable and prohibited activities in units, common areas, and project grounds, PHAs and owners provide a structure for treating tenants equitably and for making sure that tenants treat each other and their units with care and consideration. House rules are also beneficial in keeping the properties safe and clean and making them a little more appealing and livable to the residents. House rules are an actual attachment to the lease, but they do not replace the lease language in any way. House rules must be related to the safety, care, and cleanliness of units in the building and related to the care and comfort of others. But again, they must not create or disparate impact on tenants based on race, color, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. Items such as littering, guests or guest parking and guest behavior, noise levels, rules governing use of project grounds and common areas. These are all typical items that are specified and can be found included in house rules. Tenant selection plans. PHAs and owners must develop and make public written tenant selection plans and policies and procedures that include descriptions of both the program and the project eligibility requirements. Furthermore, the TSP must include information on the PHA or owner's screening criteria, the unit size and occupancy standards, income limits, preferences, and unit transfer policies. These are spelled out in Figure 4-2 of HUD Handbook 4350.3 and provides excellent guidance for PHAs and owners to develop their tenant selection plans. There are 9 required topics which are listed here on this slide, such as project eligibility, income limits, procedures for accepting rental applications, unit occupancy and size standards, transfers, policies to comply with 504 and fair housing, policy for opening and closing the project's waiting list. There are certain requirements that must be adhered to and followed when opening and closing project wait lists. So those must be fully documented and disclosed in the tenant selection plan. Eligibility of students is another issue. This may be new for some PHA staff, and we're not going to talk specifically about the student rule today in the interest of time, but just be aware that there are restrictions in occupancy under HUD's multifamily housing programs for occupancy of students. And lastly, policies for complying with VAWA, which we discussed on the previous slide a few minutes ago. These are the 9 required topics. In addition to that, there are essentially 11 additional recommended topics which HUD feels should be included in the tenant selection plan. And I'm not going to read through all of them here this afternoon. So again, I refer you to Figure 4-2 of HUD Handbook 4350.3. Be aware that tenant selection plans must be made available for review and comment by applicants and tenants. So be certain, again, to post these in the project rental office, common areas, or other places where leasing activities occur. Be sure to have a copy readily available for review and inspection by any HUD staff or auditors upon request. TSP is similar to an ACOP but covers eligibility and admission, not necessarily occupancy. A note here that HUD does not physically approve the project's tenant selection plan unless the PHA owner adopts a local or residency preference. Then I'm sure they'll want to review it. TSPs are reviewed, however, by HUD auditors or reviewers during a compliance audit or an MOR. Annual tenant selection plan updates they're not required. However, modifications to the tenant selection plan may be required if it fails to comply with HUD requirements, or in the event HUD implements new policy guidance or requirements or changes existing policy. So keep that in mind. It's important to note that these plans are not just written once, filed away, and forgotten about. They must be continually reviewed, updated, and revised either on an annual basis or in the event of a HUD policy change. So I suggest that you review these tenant selection plans at least annually to ensure they're up to date with current practices and that your staff are actually following these plans. The tenant selection plan must also include language on the PHA or owner's procedures on how the owner will review and update the tenant selection plan if necessary. So even though it's not required to receive annual updates, there should be some language in the plan that informs any potential applicant or an existing tenant how the PHA or owner updates the plan in the event it does need to be updated. Lastly, PHA or owner's tenant selection plan. This must be in place prior to RAD closing. Just to note, some PHAs or procedures may easily translate into the TSP, but just think about it. Just because you've been doing something a certain way for many years doesn't mean, doesn't mean that you keep doing it that way or that's the best way to do it. So there may also be some requirements in the 4350.3 which are very different than what the PHA staff may be accustomed to. Another note that staff will need training on what the policies and procedures are in order to ensure they're following tenant selection plan and processing applications accordingly. My suggestion is don't wait for an MOR to find out if your staff is or isn't doing something right. That's not the time to find out that applications or screening criteria have not been or are not being conducted consistently or in accordance with the developed plan. Staff responsible for the oversight and administration of the RAD PVRA project, they should be familiar with how the plan identifies how applications are processed, but they also want to test this system by reviewing staff's policies and procedures on whether they're following the plan or not. It's just not a good business practice to determine at a compliance review or during an MOR that your staff are not adhering to the policies that you have developed internally. So keep that in mind. Resident rights and participation, we discussed some of this earlier under house rules. However, there are a few stipulations here we didn't discuss earlier. No screening, rescreening of tenants upon conversion. Resident rights, they have the right to return, so all existing in-place tenants at time of conversion have the right to return to the RAD project, including transfer of assistance. Phase-in of tenant rent increases, we haven't yet discussed this, but if a tenant's monthly rent increases by more than the greater of 10% or $25 purely as the result of RAD conversion, then the rent increase will be phased in either a 3 or a 5-year period. The PHA or owner must create a policy setting the length of the phase-in period at 3 years or 5 years, or maybe a combination of both, depending on their individual deal, circumstances of their RAD deal. Lastly, resident rights are clearly written and defined in the Resident Rights and Responsibility brochure. PHAs and owners must provide each tenant with this brochure at time of initial move-in and also during annual recertification. Another best practice here is to have the applicant or tenant sign an acknowledgement of receipt of this brochure and retain that acknowledgement in the tenant file as documentation that the brochure was in fact provided at move-in or annual recertification. Again, compliance auditors will be looking for some form of acknowledgement. On to grievance procedures. Due to requirements in the RAD statute, HUD is incorporating resident procedural rights which require that residents be provided with a notice of specific grounds of the PHA or owner's proposed adverse action, as well as their formal hearing. Residents have an opportunity for an informal hearing with the impartial member of the PHA or owner's staff within a reasonable amount of time, and residents have the opportunity to be represented by another person of their choice. They have the right to ask questions. They have the right to have others make statements on their behalf and to examine any regulations or evidence or documentation that was relied upon by the project owner as the basis for the adverse action. So with reasonable notice to the PHA or owner prior to hearing and at their resident's own cost, residents may also copy any documents or records related to the proposed adverse action. And PHAs and owners must provide the resident with a written decision within a reasonable time period stating the grounds for their adverse action, and the evidence of the PHA or owner relied on for the basis of their decision. Keep that in mind under grievance procedures. Over to pets. A few comments here on pets and pet policies is that existing pets must be grandfathered into the property at RAD conversion. PHAs and owners, though, they have the ability to restrict households after conversion which were not part of the RAD conversion, and so as not to grandfather them in. A best practice here is to develop a list of households that were in existence at the time of RAD conversion who may be subject to certain requirements or grandfathering clauses, and keep this list as a permanent secure record of which households were in place at conversion. We all know that staff changes, things happen. A list of this nature will go a long way in evidencing who was in place at time of conversion, who's falling under grandfathered clauses, things of that nature. PHAs and owners must develop pet rules using requirements found in HUD 4350.1, which again is HUD's Asset Project Servicing Manual, and also in HUD Handbook 4350.3, which is the Occupancy Manual under Chapter 6. So in the event you're going to allow pets, you must develop pet rules. Again, existing pets that were in place at the time of conversion must be grandfathered in. And a quick comment here on assistance animals. They're not considered as pets and do not fall under pet rules. However, PHAs and owners can develop a reasonable policies and procedures for assistance animals. So keep that in mind too. Choice mobility requirement applies to all RAD transactions regardless of the project receive an exemption or not. Exemptions are granted on a first-come, first-served basis. And residents and projects converting under PBRA may request a next available voucher after 2 years of occupancy. I believe this is a 1-year occupancy for PBV. However, the vouchering agency may limit to not more than 15% of the project in any given year and not more than a third or 33% of their voucher turnover for RAD. The assistance always remains with the project. The mobility voucher comes from the agency's voucher turnover. And it's important to note here that choice mobility for PBRA after RAD conversion occurs is the later of 24 months from the HAP contract execution date or 24 months after the move-in date. There are two stipulations there. I want to take a few minutes, and I realize we're running a little bit behind, so if folks need to jump off the call today, feel free. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about some of HUD's online multifamily housing systems, and we'll get into a brief discussion on the required use of some of them. But essentially, HUD utilizes several online systems to track and monitor properties with RAD PBRA HAP contracts. Any questions regarding access to the online systems can be directed at the Multifamily Housing Help Desk via email at realestate@mgmt.hud.gov or via telephone via 1-800-767-7588. You can also find it through an online search of HUD systems. The first step in gaining access to HUD's online multifamily systems is obtaining Web Access Secure System, or a WAS ID. PHAs and owners must obtain a WAS ID in order to gain access into other HUD online systems such as EIV and TRAX. And in the interest of time, we're not going to go into the specifics here, but further information and guidance for applying for a WAS ID, please contact the Real Estate Assessment Center, or REAC. Their Technical Assistance Center team, the TAC team, is available via telephone at 1-888-245-4860 or available via email at reac_tac@hud.gov. HUD's policy is that participants in multifamily housing programs be responsible individuals, and as such, establish regulations and uniform standards for their approval and disapproval or withholding of action of principals and projects based on past performance. So here we're talking about the previous participation certification program and the Active Partners Performance System, or APPS. The APPS system was effective in July 1st, 2006. and the use of this system is required by all participants. There is an apps industry user guide that we provided a link to here that provides very specific detail and information on how to access the app system. But if a participant is notified by HUD that approval is conditional or being withheld, a note here is that they have the right to request an administrative hearing before a departmental officer, and the request must be submitted within 30 calendar days. Over to EIV. EIV is a big topic here, and use of HUD's EIV system is required as a third-party source to verify tenant employment and income information during the certification and recertification process. The requirement and objective to utilize EIV was to reduce administrative and subsidy payment errors. HUD's multifamily EIV system is different than the EIV system used by public and Indian housing programs. So PHAs and owners must follow all EIV requirements as identified in HUD Handbook 4350.3. Chapter 9. When HUD rewrote the 4350.3, they dedicated the entire Chapter 9 specifically to multifamily EIV. So there's a lot of useful information in this chapter regarding EIV access and its use, so please familiarize yourself with this handbook in this chapter. PHAs and owners of projects converting to PBRA must remove PIH EIV access effective on the HAP contract execution date, and they'll do so by contacting the EIV coordinator at the HUD Regional Center or the Program Center office. But then again, they must obtain access to HUD multifamily EIV system within 90 days from the date of the HAP contract is signed. PHA and owner staff who use the EIV system and who may view EIV related data in their day-to-day job functions must sign and retain copies of the EIV Coordinator Access Form, or CAF, User Access Form, which is a UAF, as well as retain the owner signed agreement for EIV. HUD requires, and compliance auditors will want to know who's using the system, and who has access to the EIV reports and the data, and ensure that they've all completed these forms and that they're properly trained on proper use and security of this data. Lastly, use of the EIV and U brochure is required at the time of move-in and or annual recertification. So EIV and U brochure, that can be ordered from online from HUD's direct distribution center. Quantities ordered should be sufficient to cover an upcoming year. The brochure is also available for download at the Multifamily RIP website. And translated version of the brochure for non-English speaking households are posted to the Multifamily RIP website too, and on HUD's limited English proficiency website. So these versions will not be available in order through the HUD Direct Distribution Center. Just keep that in mind. But you definitely will want to order those and make them available to your new applicants during the move-in process and annual recertification. PHAs and owners must develop comprehensive and written EIV policies and procedures that describe who has access to the EIV system, specify how the EIV data is protected and secured, so unauthorized staff cannot view confidential EIV-related data, must specify when each EIV report is run and reviewed, and identify how staff use data in EIV reports to make their decisions and their determinations. So again, I recommend reviewing Chapter 9 of the HUD 4350.3 and also HUD Notice 2013-06 that provides additional details and information on HUD's multifamily EIV. Just a note here, there are penalties associated with not using EIV. So they include either a citation or a finding on the project's compliance review or management occupancy review. And that's going to require that PHA or owner evidence the correction prior to closing that audit. Another penalty is a potential 5% decrease in the voucher payment for the month following the date the violation was found, and for each subsequent month until the violation is corrected. So this can get quite hefty, and it's important to know and understand the rules and expectations for accessing and using the multifamily EIV system and EIV reports data. On to tracks. As we mentioned, PHAs and owners converting under PBRA are required to access and send information to HUD's track system. They're responsible for electronically transmitting data either directly, or they may also choose to use what's called a service provider. TRACS compliant software used to produce certifications in subsidy buildings must be obtained from a vendor who certifies the software is compliant with HUD requirements. Most of them are at this point. A note about Service Bureau, that may be a viable option for some of the smaller PHAs or owners who aren't willing or aren't able to absorb the expense of the automated software. Service bureaus will perform these certification and TRACS reporting services on behalf of PHAs and owners for a nominal fee. PHAs and owners must begin submitting HUD 5059 and 59A data to TRACS beginning on the HAP contract effective date. The deadline for transmission of monthly HAP vouchers and all related electronic TRACS files supporting the monthly voucher is the 10th day of the month directly preceding the voucher payment month. So for example, February monthly voucher TRACS submission would be due to HUD and TRACS on or before January 10th. A note here for the remainder of the first calendar year in which the HAP contract becomes effective, a RAD PBRA converted project will be funded through the PIH program accounts at the level of public housing subsidy available. So HUD has released 2 documents to assist PHAs or owners in calculating and accessing the public housing subsidy that will be available for converted projects, and that's the initial year funding processing instructions and the initial year funding tool. The initial year funding tool, a lot of you may have experience with if you submitted the RAD application, so you may have that, and that will determine the amount of subsidy available for you for this period. However, this tool or this spreadsheet will also be submitted in final form at the RAD closing, so keep that in mind. Until the beginning of the calendar year following the year in which the HAP is effective, funding from the RAD contract will come from the PIH program, as we just mentioned. However, PHAs and owners still need a voucher through the TRACS system, and all vouchers transmitted to TRACS during this time must include an accurate representation of the tenant population and must be submitted with an OAR request, an owner agent request, or miscellaneous accounting request, which adjusts the total voucher amount to $0. The PH and owner and the HUD multifamily account executive or their project manager must complete the following steps monthly during the initial conversion year. So the PHA or owner generates the HAP and enters the AOR Q request, which essentially zeroes out the voucher to $0. They then either fax or email it to the HUD multifamily account executive. The HUD multifamily account executive or project manager, they review it and or approve it. If it's approved, they'll return it back to the PHA or owner. There may be an instance where they're requesting additional information, in which case the PHA or owner will have to provide maybe a missing certification or some tenant data that's on the voucher that may not have been submitted already. But essentially upon receipt of approval, the PHA or owner will have to transmit that voucher electronically to TRACS using the TRACS compliant software or a service provider. So it's important to note that during this initial year conversion, all monthly HAP vouchers must be submitted to the HUD multifamily account executive or project manager for review and approval. Use of HUD's online TRACS system will require users to access the online system and require completion of TRACS online security awareness training. Training awareness certificates must be printed upon successful completion of the training and retained in a project folder or binder. Again, these certificates must be made available for compliance auditors or MOR staff conducting an audit. Additional information on HUD's TRACS system and the TRACS monthly activity transmission, or what we call the MAT guide, is available at this link here on our screen. And the MAT guide provides very informative and useful information on resolving discrepancies and errors. So that is a great source of information. Lastly, we're going to shift quickly over to RAD post conversion monitoring. PHAs and owners comply with HUD's Uniform Financial Reporting Standards So PHAs and owners, owner entities under RAD PBRA will be required to submit financial information electronically to HUD, and that's on an annual basis, to the Multifamily Financial Assessment Subsystem, or FAS. FAS automates the submission of annual financial data for projects and HUD subsidies, and also facilitates management and prioritization of the multifamily housing portfolio by performing automated assessments of the financial data that is submitted. So it highlights projects for which compliance deficiencies may be identified. We refer to these as flags. In the event that a flag occurs in the electronic financial statement submission, that will require a PHA or an owner, or may also involve their financial auditing firm's assistance to help resolve or remove any of these flags from the financial audit submission. Failure to do so will then result in a flag of the PHA or owner in HUD's app system, which we really don't recommend and we don't like to see. So it's important to resolve these financial flags as soon as possible upon receipt. Again, here the Multifamily Housing Industry Guide is available at the link provided. It's another great source of information on the automated financial statement process. PHA is the owner of a multifamily project. The PHA is required to submit consolidated financial statements to PIH React via the FAST PHA. However, the PHA must submit a separate unaudited information for each multifamily project via FAST Multifamily. And this applies in instances where the PHA owns the multifamily project and the multifamily projects have the same tax identification number as the PHA. If the owner of the property converting to PBRA assistance under RAD has a different tax ID number from the PHA, then the owner must submit an audited or owner-certified financial statement based on the requirements in HUD's Uniform Financial Statement. So keep that in mind too. I want to touch base here on compliance audits and management and occupancy review, or an MOR. MOR must be converted, or compliance review must be conducted at the converted project within 6 months of the closing. So keep that time frame in mind. HUD will want to come out and take a look at the tenant maintenance and procurement files at the project, as well as view the property's physical condition once the project closes. The official form that is used during the management and occupancy review process is HUD Form 9834. It's comprised of several pieces of information, which includes a desk review that's included by HUD staff, an on-site review questionnaire that's used during the on-site portion, and asks the PHA or owner numerous questions on procurement, staffing services, as well as including a tenant file review checklist that the HUD staff use to evaluate the PHA or owner's tenant files, which are selected for review. And lastly, a summary report or report rating, along with any deficiencies, is included in this form. And that's typically what's provided to the PHA or owner within 30 days after the on-site portion of the review. The 9834 is available on HUD Clips or at HUD.gov and can be found by a simple Google search. My suggestion is PHAs and owner staff download this form, review it, and familiarize themselves with it, and the questionnaire, the on-site questionnaire piece, well in advance of any MOR. The tenant file review checklists that are included in the 9834, those are excellent and can be also used internally by staff to conduct their own internal audits of the tenant files in advance of preparation of an MOR. So be sure to print those out and use them and coordinate with your own internal audits of tenant files prior to HUD coming out on site. Lastly, quick note on MORs. In years past, they have been conducted annually. However, HUD is considering switching to a risk-based approach in future years for other HUD multifamily assisted housing projects. And we're not certain if the RAD projects will be included here under the revised risk-based approach in the near future, or if they will be subject to annual MNRs, but we'll keep our eyes and ears open for any future information that impact the RAD post-closing monitoring. Lastly, under post-conversion monitoring, we're going to discuss for a few minutes the REACT physical inspection process in accordance with 24 CFR Part 5. HUD-assisted multifamily housing must be maintained in decent, safe, and sanitary condition and in good repair. A REACT physical inspection will take place as soon as possible after the RAD closing. Projects converting under RAD PBRA are subject to REACT physical inspection protocols rather than HQS inspection standard protocols. REACT physical inspection requirements are definitely more stringent than the HQS inspection standards, and these inspections are typically conducted by HUD-trained inspectors or contractors. They use a tablet or software with HUD's software system loaded on it, where they record inspection results and project conditions at the time of the inspection. These results are then uploaded to HUD's REACT inspection portal, where the inspection results are stored and shared with PHAs and owners. Notification of the inspections are received via email by the PHA or owner. If rehab, just a note, quick note here about rehabilitation. If rehab is occurring at the project and the project has FHA insurance, the first inspection will not occur until that rehab is complete. If rehab is being done and the project does not have FHA financing, the PHA or owner can submit a formal request to postpone the inspection until the rehab is complete. So keep those two things in mind. After the initial inspection, the initial physical inspection, the schedule of subsequent physical inspections will be determined in accordance with HUD policies and procedures. So essentially, depending on the score, and the score will determine whether or not the project is re-inspected every year, every second year, or every third year. Lastly, for more information on REACT physical inspections and how to prepare for REACT physical inspections, we included a hyperlink here that says "See Preparing for REACT Inspections." You could probably also conduct a Google search for this document, which is very helpful in preparing for your on-site REACT physical inspections. Lastly, I know we're running over on time. If you haven't already done so, there is a RIP listserv, which I suggest you signing up. It's available at HUD.gov. And the listserv provides email notifications and updates to any HUD multifamily policy procedure changes. It includes RIP tips, things of that nature. So I highly suggest signing up for that RIP listserv email notification. And another suggestion that we discussed on several occasions in today's webinar is to download and have available all the HUD multifamily handbooks, guidebooks, and notices. I've included several of the important ones on either previous slides or this slide here. So please make note of them and be sure to download them and have them available for HUD staff, or excuse me, for site staff or project staff. Lastly, here's a listing of additional resources that may be helpful to you. They include the RAD website, which is full of useful information, notices, forms, tools, or checklists. But that also includes conversion case studies, which I found to be very helpful. There's also a full library, just full of documentation available at your fingertips at this RAD website. So please write this down and keep this in mind in two, and I can email you that in the event you would like to receive that. Lastly, there are two email addresses I'd like to point out, and these are for your benefits. So one email address is for Component 1 transactions, and that's rad@hud.gov. And the other email address of rad2@hud.gov is strictly for RAD Component 2 transactions. So in the event you have any questions regarding your RAD deal or your application or the RAD conversion process, I highly suggest you use the appropriate address and reach out to them. They're a great source of information to. I'd also like to mention here that Quadel has several upcoming trainings that we'd like to make you aware of. And we have regularly scheduled assisted housing manager and low-income housing tax credit trainings in several areas of the country. and also a RAD PBRA training, which is scheduled in our Indianapolis office October 12th through 13th of this upcoming year. Registration for any of these trainings and many more can be completed online at our website at quadel.com, or you can also find us on social media. So look for us, friend us on Facebook, friend us on Twitter or LinkedIn, and stay up to date with any of these training course offerings that we have. So I apologize for running today. I know everybody's time is of the essence, but that concludes today's RAD PBR webinar, and I hope that you enjoyed our time together. You've been a great audience. I hope you come away with a greater understanding of HUD's RAD PBRA program. And even though we ran over, I'd like to remain around for a few minutes and help answer any questions that you may have. Questions can also be directed to me after today's webinar, either via telephone or via the email listed here. So with that, I'd like to open it up and see if, Nick, are you aware of any questions that we have? I have one question here. May you please go back one slide? And I'm not sure which slide you were referencing. So if you would like to email me after today's webinar, please feel free to do so, and I will be happy to discuss the slide in question. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Nick, anything else further today? Well, with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your time and attention today. My apologies again for running over. There was a lot of information to cover. Again, in the event that you have a question, feel free to email me or call me, and I'll be more than happy to help you. We hope you have a great afternoon, and thanks again. Just a reminder that there will be a brief survey upon exiting this afternoon's webinar, so we hope you'll take a couple of minutes out of your time to answer our questions, which is very useful to us in future content development and webinars. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.